You need to understand the market realities here. That's what Levi Coleman said as he straightened his tie and slid the compensation letter across his mahogany desk. A single figure on that page confirmed every concern I'd quietly carried for the last 18 months. Senior data architect, 13 years of experience. Compensation adjusted to align with current market benchmarks and internal parity structures. Internal parity, it turned out, meant I was earning 42% less than the consultant they had hired the previous month to audit my own work. The same consultant who spent his first week asking me to explain what a data pipeline was. Same responsibilities, half my tenure, but he had board connections and a Wharton degree. Take the weekend to think about it, Levi added, tapping his fingers on the desk as if this were a routine discussion, not an insult wrapped in polished corporate language. We believe this accurately reflects your value to the organization. I didn't take the weekend. I didn't even take an hour. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope I had prepared 3 days earlier, after a colleague accidentally forwarded the wrong spreadsheet, the one listing everyone's real compensation. I signed the letter with a company-branded ballpoint pen and slid it back across the desk without hesitation. Effective immediately, I said. 2:30 p.m. that day. By 2:33 p.m., my building access badge was disabled. By 2:41 p.m., my company laptop was wiped remotely. By 3:15 p.m., the CFO was leaving urgent voicemails, the kind usually reserved for critical system failures. By 4 p.m., 7 executives were in an emergency meeting, staring at dashboards flashing red the moment my access disappeared, with projected losses already exceeding $32 million. But to understand how a single resignation became the most expensive in company history, you have to start earlier, when I chose to value my work in a way the company refused to. If you appreciate stories where the people who build systems end up teaching costly lessons to those who underestimate them, this is one of those stories. My name is Sophia Hayes. I'm 43 years old, and I've spent the last 2 decades building data infrastructures that companies rely on but rarely fully understand. I didn't attend an Ivy League school. I earned my degree at a solid state university where teaching mattered more than publishing for tenure. Before that, I worked my way through community college while managing a restaurant at night, learning to function on 4 hours of sleep and make decisions under pressure. Those years taught me a simple truth: when systems fail, credentials don't matter. What matters is whether you can fix the problem before it escalates. That principle guided every role I took afterward. I joined Strive Innovations 12 years ago, when the company was still defining itself. They called themselves a technology solutions provider, which really meant helping businesses make sense of their data. Our clients included healthcare systems and financial institutions, all dependent on our platform to process, analyze, and protect large volumes of sensitive information. At the time, the company had about 200 employees, and the systems were barely holding together. The data architecture was a mess built by long-gone contractors. There was no documentation, no clear understanding of how components interacted. Databases communicated through scripts written during overnight sessions and never explained. I became essential by learning what others avoided because it seemed tedious or overly complex. I volunteered for migrations no one wanted, took ownership of legacy systems that made senior developers uncomfortable, and learned every dependency, edge case, and unusual behavior that could bring everything down at the worst possible moment. People started saying, "Ask Sophia, she'll know." At first, it was informal. Eventually, it became standard practice. I remember my first major crisis clearly: a database corruption incident on a Friday night before a long weekend. Client data was at risk, compliance violations were accumulating, and executives were panicking because they couldn't yet measure the damage. I had been with the company less than 8 months. I traced the issue to a backup script that had been modified without proper testing, restored the data, identified corruption patterns, and rebuilt the affected records before Monday morning. The CEO at the time, Robert Finch, who had founded the company in his garage, sent a short email. "You saved us. Thank you." That was the role. Prevent disasters before anyone fully grasped how close we came. Keep the infrastructure stable so the business could function. Handle the unglamorous work that made everyone else's success possible. Over time, my responsibilities expanded. I moved from data engineer to senior engineer, then lead architect, then principal architect, though HR consistently kept my title just below the level that would trigger a meaningful salary adjustment. I built data governance frameworks, designed security protocols, and created disaster recovery procedures that carried us through audits and compliance reviews. I learned about failure not from textbooks, but from real incidents. A vendor changing an API without notice, a marketing employee running an unauthorized query that froze production, a junior developer deploying code on a Friday afternoon that corrupted 3 months of financial data. I documented everything, not because I expected recognition, but because that's how I work. Root cause analysis, timelines, pattern recognition. What failed, why it failed, and which warnings were missed beforehand. Then Strive decided to scale aggressively. The board hired new leadership with impressive credentials and ambitious plans. Our new CEO, Wyatt Cooper, came from a Fortune 500 background and spoke constantly about transformation and market disruption. He brought in a new CFO, a new chief people officer, and a new operating philosophy. The goal was to elevate the talent brand. In practice, that meant hiring people with prestigious resumes and reshaping compensation around perceived market value rather than actual contribution. Engineering wasn't spared. Strategy consultants with MBAs began making architectural decisions they didn't fully understand. Transformation leads who had never written production code created frameworks and alignment charts, but couldn't explain how our systems actually functioned. Meanwhile, I was still the one getting calls at 1:47 a.m. when a critical integration failed, and no one else could diagnose it. The first clear warning came with the launch of the Strategic Leadership Development Program. It targeted so-called high-potential early career talent, recent graduates from elite schools. They received rotational assignments, executive mentors, and starting salaries that left experienced engineers quietly comparing notes. One of them was Henry Wallace, 26 years old, with a Wharton MBA and an undergraduate degree in economics. He was sharp in the academic sense, but had no hands-on experience with the systems he was meant to help optimize. He had worked briefly at a management consulting firm and had polished slide decks to show for it. He was given the title of Business Strategy Analyst. Within 6 months, he became a strategy manager. Within a year, Director of Data Strategy and Transformation. He reported directly to the CFO and was given influence over technical roadmaps, despite not understanding what a data pipeline actually did. One afternoon, Henry circulated an internal analysis comparing compensation levels between traditional technical roles and what were labeled strategic technical leadership positions. The figures were described as anonymized, but with a small sample size, anonymity was largely symbolic. That's when I saw it clearly in writing. After 13 years, my total compensation was barely higher than what new hires in the leadership program were receiving on their first day. Henry, in particular, the person who regularly asked me to explain basic concepts, was earning 42% more than I was. I didn't confront anyone right away. Instead, I took a more deliberate approach. I started preparing. The defining moment came 3 months later in Levi Coleman's office. Levi was our VP of People Operations, a title that sounded more elevated than HR director, but functionally meant the same thing. He always looked worn down, as if he were constantly managing problems he hadn't created. Sophia, he said, pulling up a document on his screen, we've completed our annual compensation calibration, and I wanted to review your adjustment personally. He turned the monitor toward me. The number was difficult to justify. A 2.3% increase, barely enough to offset inflation, and nowhere near recognition for 13 years of keeping the company's infrastructure operational. This reflects our internal parity frameworks, Levi said, using the familiar corporate phrasing that removed accountability. We've standardized compensation across comparable role functions. Comparable to whom? I asked, even though I already knew. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The new strategic leadership roles require credentials that command different market rates. You need to understand the market realities here. Market realities, I repeated. So Henry Wallace, who asks me daily to explain fundamentals, earns 42% more than I do because he has an MBA. Levi's expression tightened. I can't discuss another employee's compensation. You don't need to. I've already seen the numbers. I didn't mention the spreadsheet from finance that had been accidentally sent to the wrong list. Let me be clear, I said. 13 years of building and maintaining systems that generate millions in revenue are valued less than 2 years in a Wharton degree. Sophia, it's not that simple. It is simple, I replied. You're saying credentials outweigh competence, and that presentation skills matter more than keeping systems running. Levi shifted in his chair. We value your contributions, but we need to stay competitive in attracting talent. By undercompensating the talent you already have, I said. Take the weekend to think it over, he replied, adopting a tone meant to sound reassuring. We believe this reflects your value appropriately. If you have concerns, we can revisit this next cycle. The next cycle, always deferred, never meaningful. I had prepared for this moment, not because I wanted it, but because the pattern was impossible to ignore. I reached into my bag and took out the envelope I had already prepared. After seeing that spreadsheet, the resignation letter had been signed and dated. I only needed to add the time. I wrote 2:30 p.m. and slid it across the desk. Levi stared at it in silence. You don't have to decide right now. I already did. 3 days ago, when I saw how little this company values my work, this conversation just confirmed it. Sophia, let's discuss this. We can escalate, maybe adjust. There isn't room, I said, standing up and gathering my bag. You've just told me that 13 years of crisis management and system design are worth 2.3%. I accept that message. It's the clearest communication this company has given me in years. At least give us 2 weeks, he said. Document everything. Help with the transition. I smiled, genuinely for the first time in months. My documentation is complete. Every system and process is written down. You just need someone who can understand it. At 2:30 p.m., I left Levi's office. At 2:33, my badge no longer worked at the secure development area. At 2:41, my laptop shut down as it was wiped remotely. At 2:45, my company phone was disabled. I packed my personal items, a photo from my daughter's college graduation, a mug that read, "I turn coffee into data pipelines," and the leather notebook I'd kept for years, filled with incident notes, system behaviors, and operational knowledge that never fit into official documentation designed for ideal conditions. I walked through the open workspace. Most people avoided eye contact. A few looked up with expressions ranging from shock to recognition. Ahmed Patel, a senior engineer, gave me a brief nod that said enough. I took the elevator to the parking garage, dropped my badge and key into the return box, and went to my car. At 2:54 p.m., I checked my personal phone. An email was waiting from the company I'd been speaking with for the past month, the one that had replied to my initial outreach with, "We were hoping you'd consider us." They had made an offer 3 weeks earlier, contingent only on my availability. I replied, "Tomorrow morning." At 3:07 p.m., the first alert triggered inside Strive's monitoring systems. I didn't see it, but I knew exactly how it appeared. Elevated error rates in the primary ingestion pipeline, queue depth warnings exceeding thresholds, automated alerts sent to on-call engineers who had only handled minor incidents while I addressed critical ones. At 3:15, the CFO, Warren Sutherland, called my phone. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I declined. His message said, "Sophia, we have an urgent situation. Please call back immediately." At 3:22, Levi called. I declined that as well. He texted, "Critical system issues. Can we talk?" At 3:31, Ahmed texted me, "Whatever you did, respect. They're panicking up here." Henry just asked me again what a data pipeline is. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove home, made tea, and opened my laptop to review onboarding documents from my new employer. At 4 p.m., as I later learned, 7 executives were in an emergency meeting. Wyatt Cooper, the CEO, Warren Sutherland, the CFO, Levi Coleman from HR, Henry Wallace, nominally leading data strategy, Helen Park, the CTO hired 4 months earlier, Luis Delgado, VP of Engineering, and Rachel Kim from Legal. Notes from that meeting later shared by a colleague read like a study in organizational breakdown. 4:03 p.m., emergency executive session. Wyatt opened with controlled calm. "We're facing a critical failure in our data infrastructure. Client-facing systems are down. I need clarity on cause and recovery timeline." Helen presented a dashboard, cascading failures in the primary pipeline, Error rates at 47% and rising. Ingestion is backing up. Client data isn't processing. We risk SLA breaches within 2 hours. What caused it? Warren asked. We're investigating, Helen replied. The standard response when answers aren't yet available. Where's Sophia? Luis asked, already anticipating the response. The room went silent. Levi cleared his throat. Sophia Hayes resigned this afternoon. Effective immediately. Resigned or forced out? Someone asked the question. She resigned, Levi said carefully, following her compensation review meeting. Wyatt's expression shifted from concern to something more severe. What compensation review? Levi opened a document on his tablet. Annual calibration process. She received a 2.3% adjustment aligned with internal parity guidelines for technical roles. Who approved that? Wyatt asked. The compensation committee, Levi replied, based on benchmarking for comparable positions. Warren leaned forward. Define comparable. Senior technical roles without strategic leadership responsibilities. Sophia built our entire data architecture, Luis said sharply. She's prevented more outages than anyone else here and trained half the engineering team. What part of that isn't strategic? The guidelines emphasize forward-looking transformation capabilities, Levi said, sounding rehearsed. Sophia's expertise is valued, but it's considered maintenance-focused rather than innovation-driven. Maintenance-focused? Helen repeated. The systems are failing right now because the person maintaining them left. Doesn't that suggest the maintenance was critical? Can we bring her back? Wyatt asked Levi. What would it take? I've tried calling. She's not responding. Try again, Warren said. Offer whatever is necessary. We're losing money every minute. Henry, silent until then, spoke up. I've worked closely with Sophia on data strategy. I can guide the team through the immediate issue. Everyone turned toward him. Helen looked doubtful. You understand the pipeline architecture? I understand the strategic framework, Henry said. The technical team can manage implementation. The technical team is lost, Luis replied, because the one person who understood the full system just left. Can you restart the ingestion service? That's an execution detail. Can you restart the service? Luis repeated. Henry paused. I'd need to review the documentation. There isn't documentation for this scenario, Ahmed said over the remote line, at least not for this failure mode. Sophia knew the system end to end. She documented normal operations, but this isn't normal. These were issues she diagnosed quickly because she understood dependencies no one else mapped. Why weren't those documented? Wyatt demanded. They were, Ahmed said carefully, in Sophia's personal notes. Official documentation takes months to approve, and these were edge cases learned through experience. Rachel from legal spoke up. Do those notes belong to the company? Ahmed replied. The systems belong to the company. The knowledge of how they behave in production is expertise, not property. You can't force someone to give that up. Can we hire her as a consultant? Warren asked. Emergency rates? Anything. Levi called again. It went to voicemail. He left a message offering alternative arrangements and revised compensation. At 4:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with another voicemail. This time it was Warren, his voice strained. Sophia, this is Warren Sutherland. We'd like to discuss bringing you back as a consultant. Name your rate. We need you urgently. I didn't respond. At 5:15 p.m., the data pipeline failed completely. Performance didn't just degrade, it stopped. Client data ceased flowing. The backup systems I'd designed for short outages were overwhelmed because no one knew how to rebalance the load manually. At 5:33 p.m., the first client complaint arrived, a healthcare system reliant on real-time patient data. Their staff couldn't access updated records and warned they would invoke SLA penalties at $50,000 per hour. By 6 p.m., 3 more clients filed formal complaints. A financial firm couldn't process reconciliations. A retailer couldn't update inventory. A logistics company lost shipment visibility. At 6:30 p.m., Wyatt approved an offer of $100,000 for a single day of emergency consulting. The email was urgent and formal. I replied at 6:45 p.m. Thank you for reaching out. I'm unable to accept consulting work as I've accepted a full-time role elsewhere. I'm confident your team will resolve the issue. Best wishes. By 7 p.m., according to Ahmed, the meeting had devolved into blame. Who approved the compensation model? Why wasn't Sophia identified as a single point of failure? Why were new hires paid more than critical senior staff? Helen managed a partial restoration by 7:30, but it was unstable. The dashboard showed warning signs I would have recognized immediately. At 8:15 p.m., the system failed again, this time taking down both primary and backup processes. Data loss became a real risk. Compliance violations were unavoidable. Legal began estimating regulatory penalties. At 9 p.m., Wyatt emailed me directly. Subject: please help us. The message admitted the compensation decision was wrong and how the situation had been mishandled. He said they needed my help and acknowledged they had failed me. I read it twice. Seeing the admission was validating, but not enough. I replied that I didn't want to fix an emergency. I wanted to be valued for the work I was already doing. They had 13 years to do that and chose not to. What they were experiencing was the cost of that choice. At 10:30 p.m., Strive achieved another partial recovery using an emergency infrastructure firm charging $15,000 an hour, 4-hour minimums, and still relying on internal engineers to explain system specifics. By midnight, estimated losses reached $32 million from downtime, penalties, and contractors, not including reputational damage or clients considering alternatives. The next morning, I started at my new company, Genesis Solutions, a mid-sized firm known for valuing technical expertise. My new boss, Dr. Eleanor Vance, had founded the company after leaving corporate environments that sidelined engineers. She'd contacted me months earlier after reading my blog on pipeline optimization. "I saw the news about your former company," she said over coffee. "Former company," I corrected. "Want to talk about it?" I gave her the short version. She nodded and said, "Some organizations only learn through consequences. Don't go back, even for consulting money." Over the next few days, Strive stabilized enough to avoid collapse, but performance remained weak. Error rates stayed high. Clients were dissatisfied. Engineers worked nonstop trying to understand systems I'd built over 13 years. Henry Wallace quietly requested a transfer to a non-technical area. 2 weeks after I left, Strive's largest client, a national healthcare network, announced it was moving to a competitor, citing concerns about infrastructure reliability and risk management. The contract was worth $18 million a year. 3 more clients followed over the next month, each citing service disruptions and system instability. Each departure represented millions in lost revenue. By the end of the quarter, Strive's stock had fallen 28%, and investor confidence had eroded. The board demanded explanations and accountability. Wyatt Cooper resigned under pressure. In his departure statement, he accepted responsibility for organizational decisions that failed to align with operational realities. In plain terms, leadership acknowledged serious mistakes. Warren Sutherland, the CFO who had offered me emergency consulting rates, stepped down soon after to pursue other opportunities. In reality, he was pushed out. Levi Coleman left the company 3 months later. He sent me a LinkedIn message saying I had been right about everything and apologizing that they hadn't listened. He said he was moving to a company that valued people over credentials and that he should have advocated more strongly on my behalf. I appreciated the message, but didn't reply. Some apologies arrived too late to change anything. Henry Wallace remained another 6 months before accepting a role at a marketing analytics firm where his MBA and presentation skills were a better fit and where he wouldn't be expected to lead technical systems he didn't fully understand. 8 months after I left, Eleanor Vance called me into her office, smiling. "You won't believe this," she said. "Strive Innovations just contacted us. They want Genesis to help rebuild their data architecture and asked specifically whether you'd consider consulting on the project." I laughed and asked what she told them. That I'd ask you, but our rates aren't negotiable, and you'd lead the engagement on your terms, or not at all. I thought it through. There was a certain irony in being paid properly to repair what had broken because my work was undervalued. At the same time, there was value in clean breaks and moving forward. I told her I'd consult on one condition. Strive would implement a policy where technical expertise was compensated on par with strategic leadership roles, where someone with 13 years of experience would not earn less than someone with 2 years and an MBA, and where transparent career paths existed without requiring people to move into management to be paid fairly. Eleanor raised an eyebrow and said that was a substantial requirement. It's non-negotiable, I replied. If they wanted my help, they needed to demonstrate that they'd learned the lesson. 2 weeks later, Strive agreed. They introduced what they called the Technical Excellence Track, a parallel path to management that allowed senior engineers to advance to roles such as principal architect, distinguished engineer, and technical fellow, with compensation equal to director and VP levels. They also audited their entire compensation structure and corrected pay for employees who had been consistently underpaid relative to their contributions. I consulted on their architecture rebuild for 6 months at a rate 4 times my former salary. Each invoice felt like confirmation that the value was finally being recognized. The project succeeded. We rebuilt the infrastructure with proper redundancy, thorough documentation, and shared knowledge. There were no longer single points of failure or systems understood by only one person. During one working session, I ran into Ahmed. He'd been promoted to senior principal engineer under the new track, with compensation that matched his impact. He said it was surprising how many leadership program participants had left. When technical results became the priority instead of frameworks, credentials mattered far less. Some lessons are learned the expensive way, I said. He added that the new HR lead came from an engineering background and understood the work. One of her first actions was auditing compensation decisions from the past 3 years. She identified a pattern of undervaluing women and engineers from non-target schools and began correcting it. Better late than never, he said. He mentioned I could return full-time and likely be made a VP. I declined. I was satisfied where I was. Eleanor valued my contributions without needing a crisis to recognize them, and that mattered more than any title. A year after my resignation, I received an email with the subject line, "Thank you." It was from Julie Carmichael, a senior engineer at Strive. She wrote that the policy changes after my departure had transformed her career. She'd been at the same level for 8 years despite consistent results. After the Technical Excellence Track launched, she was promoted to principal engineer with a 60% pay increase. She later learned that I'd made those changes a condition of my consulting work. I printed the email and kept it in my desk drawer. It meant more to me than any apology from executives trying to protect their reputations. 2 years later, I spoke at a conference on data architecture and organizational design. During the Q&A, someone asked how to handle situations where companies undervalue technical expertise. I said to document everything, know your worth, and be ready to leave when that value isn't recognized. Some organizations only learn through consequences, and it isn't your responsibility to teach them. Your responsibility is to protect your own value and find environments that respect it. After the session, a young engineer approached me. She was about 27 and said she believed she was in the same situation I'd been in. She was the only person who understood their course systems and had just learned she earned less than new hires. She said she was afraid to leave because she didn't want to abandon her team. I told her the team would survive, and if they didn't, that was a management issue, not hers. Loyalty isn't owed to organizations that don't show it in return. Know your worth, find someone who agrees, and don't apologize for choosing yourself. She thanked me and walked away. I hoped she'd find the confidence to make the choice I had. 3 years after leaving Strive, I was having lunch with Eleanor when she mentioned a new opportunity. Genesis is expanding, she said. We need someone to lead our engineering organization, someone who understands both the technical and human sides of building teams, someone who won't repeat the mistakes other companies make. Are you offering me the role? I asked. I'm saying it's yours if you want it. VP of Engineering, full equity package, and a clear mandate to build something better. I accepted. Over the next year, I built an engineering organization shaped by everything I'd learned, both from what had worked and from what had failed. We introduced transparent compensation from the start. Every engineer could see the salary bands for their level and understand exactly what was required to advance. We created technical career paths that paid on par with management tracks. Experience and contribution mattered more than credentials or pedigree. We also implemented what I called knowledge distribution requirements. No critical system could rely on a single individual. Every part of the infrastructure had to be deeply understood by at least 3 people. Documentation was mandatory. Teaching was mandatory. Making yourself replaceable was not seen as a weakness. It was a requirement for promotion. The culture we built attracted people other companies had overlooked: experienced engineers tired of being undervalued, self-taught developers passed over because they lacked the right degrees, women and minorities who had been consistently underpaid despite delivering exceptional results. Within 2 years, Genesis developed a reputation as a place where engineers genuinely wanted to work, where technical expertise was respected, where you didn't need a management title to be paid fairly, and where the people building systems were treated as assets rather than costs. 4 years after I left Strive, I ran into Wyatt Cooper at an industry event. He'd taken an advisory role at a smaller company, helping them avoid the mistakes he'd made. He spotted me across the room and came over. "Sophia," he said. I wasn't sure whether he wanted the conversation. "I don't hold grudges," I told him. "What's done is done." "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not the corporate version I sent before." "You already apologized." "I apologized for the crisis. I should have apologized for the 13 years before it. For every time we took you for granted. For every time we valued credentials over competence. For building systems that underpaid people like you while overpaying people like Henry Wallace who couldn't actually do the work." I studied him for a moment. "Did you learn anything?" I learned that the people who keep things running matter more than the people who talk about strategy. I learned that loyalty has to be earned, and we expected yours without doing that. I learned that eventually you pay the real cost, whether you're prepared for it or not. We paid it all at once, in the worst way possible. That was more honest than I expected. "I consult now," he said, "helping companies build sustainable engineering cultures. I tell them about what happened with you, about losing $32 million and 3 major clients because we couldn't get compensation right. Some listen, some don't. The ones who don't usually learn the same way we did." "Some lessons only come through pain," I said. "The expensive kind," he agreed. "For what it's worth, I've heard about what you're building at Genesis. You're doing it right." We spoke a little longer, then went our separate ways. I didn't feel angry or vindicated. I just felt certain I'd made the right decision by valuing myself enough to leave when they wouldn't. 5 years after my resignation, Strive had stabilized under new leadership. They rebuilt their technical organization, corrected compensation inequities, and created the kind of culture I'd hoped for years earlier. But the cost was steep. $32 million in the initial crisis, another $50 million in lost contracts, 18 months of reduced performance and client losses, a full executive team replaced, and lasting reputational damage. All of it could have been avoided with fair compensation and basic respect for the people doing the work. I still keep the notebook from my time there, the one filled with incident logs and system notes. On the final page, I'd written something the night I resigned. Organizations that don't value their people will eventually pay the full cost of their expertise. The only choice is whether they learn before the crisis or after. They chose after. I chose to let them.